What if the story you were blamed for was never yours to begin with? There's a photo tucked away in an old drawer in Vermont, faded, almost forgotten, of a woman standing on a porch, holding a plate of cookies she baked for her granddaughter's birthday. She had been waiting all morning, watching the road, listening for footsteps. None came. That day, the silence spoke louder than any door slammed or voice raised. And yet, a year later, her daughter would shout across a kitchen, "She abandoned us. She just walked away," as if love could be measured by presence alone, and pain didn't have a beginning. Her name was Helen, and for most of her life, she was the anchor of a family that never noticed they were drifting until she let go. She didn't fight. She didn't defend herself. When the weight of accusation landed heavy on her back, she stood straighter, but she did not speak. Because what does a woman say when the ones she birthed rewrite the story she lived? This is not the story of a villain or a victim. It is the story of a woman who chose silence, not out of weakness, but as an act of dignity. She never slammed a door. She never raised her voice. She simply stopped showing up. There was no announcement, no farewell, just a final cup of tea left steaming on the table, and a decision made between heartbeats, the kind of decision you carry alone, like folded letters you never send. They said she abandoned them, but what if it was they who closed the door first? This is Helen's story, the parts they didn't tell, the truths that never made it into the family group chat, but live on in every quiet moment, every missing invitation, every memory that makes them shift uncomfortably at holidays. It's not revenge, not exactly. It's something softer and heavier. Justice, served in silence. It had been 3 winters since Helen received her last proper invitation from her daughter's home. The kind that came with a handwritten note, the little smiley face her granddaughter used to draw next to her name. After that, it was always assumed. "Come if you want," her daughter would say half-heartedly over the phone, already distracted, already somewhere else. Helen would bring her famous apple pie anyway, knock gently, and smile as if she hadn't noticed the size, the rolled eyes, the way they rearranged the seating so she wouldn't be in the way. But that summer, it was different. There was a birthday party, not hers, not her daughter's. It was for Lily, her youngest granddaughter, the one who used to run barefoot through Helen's backyard chasing fireflies. Helen only found out about the party from the neighbor's daughter, who mentioned it in passing. The balloons, the laughter, the cake. All of it had happened just 5 miles away, and no one had told her. She didn't cry that day. She didn't even call to ask why. Instead, she sat on her porch in her creaking rocking chair and traced the rim of the chipped teacup Lily had once used during their pretend tea parties. The silence that filled her living room that day wasn't empty. It was crowded with memories of birthdays she had spent months preparing, of late-night fevers she'd soothed with cold towels and lullabies. None of it mattered now, it seemed. A week later, during a casual visit, the kind Helen had stopped initiating months ago, she walked into a scene that would stay with her forever. Her daughter, arguing with her husband, slammed a dish on the sink and spat the words that felt like knives. "She abandoned us, okay? She just stopped being part of this family." Helen had paused mid-step in the hallway, her hands clutching the knitted shawl she had brought as a gift. It was lavender, Lily's favorite color, but in that moment, it might as well have turned to ash. Her daughter's words echoed louder than any scream. Abandoned. That was the word she chose. Not forgotten, not distanced, abandoned. How cruel it is, Helen thought later, to be blamed for a distance you didn't create. She had stepped back, yes, But only after being pushed so many times, she stopped reaching forward. Only after invitations stopped arriving. Only after every conversation became a performance in which she was always too sensitive, too involved, or simply too much. That night, Helen sat by her kitchen window, staring into the dark Vermont woods behind her home. The same woods where she had once taught her daughter to pick wild blueberries. She remembered how her little girl used to cling to her apron, asking, "Are you sure these aren't poisonous, Mama?" And she'd laugh, holding up a berry to the sunlight, explaining the difference between what's good for you and what only looks sweet. What happens when your own child forgets that difference? She thought about all the times she had stood up for her daughter. When teachers dismissed her, Helen showed up. When she cried over her first heartbreak, Helen listened without judgment. She remembered the sacrifices that had no receipts, the dreams she shelved, the jobs she took to put her through college, the nights she prayed for her safety without ever expecting a thank you. And yet, one sentence, spat in a moment of stress, rewrote decades of devotion. She abandoned us, as if love could be erased that easily. Helen didn't confront her. She didn't walk into the kitchen and demand to be seen. That wasn't her way. Instead, she gently set the lavender shawl on the hallway table and turned around. She drove home with the windows down, letting the wind take away the tears she didn't let fall. In the following days, the weight of that word, abandonment, sat with her like a shadow. It followed her into her garden, where the roses bloomed without applause. It crept into her dreams, where she saw her mother's face, calm, strong, never bitter. Helen wondered what her mother would have done. Would she have written a letter? Would she have fought for her place? Or would she have done what Helen was beginning to understand, that sometimes stepping away is not surrender. Sometimes it is the final form of love. She began to notice how much space silence could occupy. The absence of her voice at family dinners, the missing reply in the group text, the empty chair at Lily's recital. None of them called to ask why. Perhaps they didn't notice. Or worse, perhaps they noticed and didn't care. Still, she refused to become bitter. Helen had always believed that bitterness was a slow poison, one she had watched consume her own mother. Instead, she turned to ritual. She cleaned the house every Sunday as if guests were coming. She baked the apple pie anyway and left it by the window to cool. She wrote letters she never sent, tucking them into a drawer she no longer opened. In her silence, she built a fortress, not to keep others out, but to protect what was left of herself. And though no one knew it yet, Helen had made a decision. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it would change everything. Because when they called it abandonment, she chose to show them what rejection really looked like. Not in anger, but in dignity. Not with revenge, but with resolve. They had thrown away the invitation to her heart. She simply stopped waiting at the door. It was just a small teacup, porcelain with delicate blue edges, part of a mismatched set Helen had collected from thrift stores and old estate sales over the years. It wasn't expensive or rare, but it held history. It was the one she always used when visiting her daughter's home. Quietly, she'd choose that same cup from the back of the cupboard, even though no one else remembered it was hers. She never mentioned it. She never had to. It was her ritual, a fragile anchor in a house that no longer felt like home. On the last day she would ever enter that kitchen, Helen placed the cup on the table just as she always had. Handle turned toward her right hand, tea bag already steeping in hot water she had boiled herself. Her daughter was upstairs, arguing again on the phone, while the grandchildren sat hypnotized in front of the television. No one greeted her. No one asked how she was or if she needed help. Helen didn't mind. At least that's what she told herself. She sat there for 15 minutes, quietly sipping her tea, watching as the sun shifted through the dusty blinds. The air was thick with familiarity, but not warmth. The house smelled of old reheated food, plastic toys, and a kind of fatigue that had nothing to do with work or chores, but everything to do with disconnection. Helen had known that scent once, long ago, in her own mother's kitchen, just before everything had started to unravel. Lily came into the room for a moment, searching for her tablet. She glanced at Helen, hesitated, and then said softly, "Mom said you don't come around anymore." Her voice wasn't accusing, just confused, as if trying to make sense of a picture that no longer fit the frame. Helen's heart clenched, not from anger, but from the deep, aching knowledge that even the children had started to receive the script. She offered a gentle smile and reached into her purse, pulling out a small pink hair clip she had found last week at the general store, the same kind Lily used to love. "I thought of you," she said, handing it over. Lily took it without much emotion, mumbled a thank you, and returned to the screen glowing in the next room. She didn't look back. That was when Helen knew. Not in a dramatic, cinematic sense, but in the quiet folding of an emotion she had carried far too long. The thread had finally snapped, not because of cruelty, but because of erosion. Years of slowly being dismissed, of becoming background noise, of love taken as convenience and presence mistaken for obligation. She didn't finish the tea. She left the cup exactly where it was, a still life in the center of chaos, a symbol of everything she had offered and everything that went unnoticed. On her drive home, the Vermont countryside blurred past in muted tones of green and gold. The roads were familiar, but they no longer felt like a path returning home. Helen drove slowly, allowing the rhythm of the engine to soothe the unease growing in her chest. At a red light, she glanced at her hands, the same hands that had bathed her daughter as a baby, sewn Halloween costumes, and wiped away adolescent tears. Now they trembled slightly as they gripped the steering wheel, not from age, but from the weight of accumulated absence. That evening, she walked through her own house in silence. She passed by framed photos of birthdays and graduations, her daughter's wedding, even Lily's christening. All those moments where she had been present, camera in hand, smiling through the sidelines. And yet, it wasn't enough. Somehow, her presence had become invisible, expected, never cherished. She opened the cabinet and took out a teacup, not the one from her daughter's house, but a similar one, slightly chipped. She filled it with hot water, added a splash of lemon, and sat alone at her small kitchen table. No voices, no accusations, just the sound of the clock ticking above the stove. In the quiet, Helen remembered something her grandmother once said, sitting on that same porch decades ago. "Some people see you only when you leave." At the time, Helen hadn't understood. Now she did, with painful clarity. She didn't return the next week, or the one after that. The group messages continued without her replies. Her daughter sent the occasional forwarded meme or video, nothing personal. No one asked about the teacup. No one mentioned the silence. But that's the thing about rituals. When they stop, something shifts. And if no one notices, perhaps the ritual was only ever one-sided. Still, Helen didn't erase them from her heart. She wasn't made of stone. She still kept a drawer of Lily's drawings. She still knew their birthdays by heart. She just stopped showing up where she wasn't truly seen. The teacup remained on her daughter's table for 3 days before someone finally washed it. Without asking whose it was, without wondering why it had been left behind. And in that simple act of indifference, Helen found her answer. Some goodbyes don't need to be said. They just need to be understood. There are moments in life when words do more than wound. They reshape the way someone exists in the eyes of those they love. For Helen, that moment came not from a stranger, not from some heated argument with a neighbor, but from the mouth of her own daughter, the child she once carried through midnight fevers and heartbreaks, whose hair she braided before school, whose first steps she had caught in her trembling arms. The same child who now looked at her as if she were an inconvenience, not a mother. It happened on a Tuesday. Helen had stopped by to deliver a quilt she had been working on for weeks, each patch cut from old dresses, baby blankets, and worn-out aprons, stitched together with hands that had long since lost their steadiness, but never their intention. It was a gift for Lily, something Helen hoped would bring warmth on cold Vermont nights, a piece of legacy wrapped in soft fabric, but she never made it past the hallway. Her daughter stood at the bottom of the stairs, frustration painted across her face, her phone buzzing nonstop in her hand. "What are you doing here, Mom?" she asked, not cruelly, but coldly. "I didn't know you were coming. Lily has dance in 20 minutes. I don't have time for—" She paused, eyes darting toward the quilt in Helen's arms. "This." Helen opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had no script for this kind of rejection, the quiet, casual dismissal of everything she had once meant. She placed the quilt gently on the armrest of the couch and murmured something about just stopping by. But before she could leave, a sharper voice echoed down the stairs. Her daughter, snapping at her husband, unaware that Helen could still hear her. "She acts like we owe her something. She just shows up, then sulks when things aren't about her. I'm so tired of pretending. She abandoned me emotionally a long time ago." Those words didn't come from rage. They came from somewhere colder, fatigue mixed with a kind of revisionist memory that hurt more than any blow. Helen felt the air leave her lungs, but she did not cry. Instead, she stood very still, like a tree learning to survive winter without shedding its dignity. She would never have spoken to her own mother like that. Even during the worst of times, during arguments over bills, over boyfriends, over life decisions, Helen had always held her tongue, or at the very least, her respect, because she believed that the hands that raised you deserved more than your exhaustion. They deserved grace. But maybe that was an outdated idea. Maybe in this new world of therapy, speak and boundaries, of protecting my peace, it had become fashionable to rewrite the past to suit the narrative. And if that meant turning your own mother into the villain of your emotional story, then so be it. Later that evening, Helen sat at her kitchen table, the light overhead flickering slightly with age. She stared at a photograph of her daughter at 10 years old, missing teeth, freckles across her nose, beaming as she held up a lopsided birthday cake. Helen remembered staying up all night to bake that cake, even though the oven had nearly caught fire, even though she had worked a double shift the day before. And now, decades later, that same child said she had been abandoned emotionally. What does that even mean? Helen thought. Is silence abandonment? Is exhaustion cruelty? Is showing up without an invitation a crime? She thought about the years she had spent swallowing her opinions to keep the peace. The times she had offered to babysit, to clean, to cook, only to be told, "We're fine, Mom." The way her presence had slowly become optional, like an old coat kept in the closet for sentimental reasons, but never worn. Still, Helen didn't let herself dwell in bitterness. Instead, she wrote that night. Not to send, just to understand. She pulled out a notepad and began with a sentence that stopped her heart. "You don't know what it cost me to be your mother." It wasn't meant as blame. It was truth. And truth, for Helen, had always been quiet, not loud, not performative, just real. She wrote about the nights spent sewing clothes from old curtains, about the meals skipped so her daughter could have lunch money, about the birthdays she celebrated alone so her child could go on trips with friends. None of it was martyrdom. It was motherhood. And perhaps that was the deepest wound of all. Not that it had been unappreciated, but that it had been forgotten entirely. The next morning, Helen folded the letter and placed it inside her drawer, beneath the stack of cards she had kept over the years, handmade ones from Lily, notes from old friends, even a few birthday wishes from her daughter during the college years when things had still felt tender. She didn't need to send it. She didn't need it to be read. Sometimes, writing was enough to carve space inside a shrinking heart. For the first time in a long while, Helen didn't feel like crying. She felt clear, as if a fog had lifted, and the landscape, though barren, was finally visible. She wasn't going to chase what didn't want to be caught. She wouldn't beg for a version of love that came with conditions. She would love them still, deeply, quietly, but from a distance that protected her. Because the truth was simple. She had never abandoned anyone. But she had, at last, stopped abandoning herself. There's a kind of ache that settles not in the chest but in the hands. When you reach for a pen, not to write something beautiful, but to unload what your voice can no longer carry. That night, after the words, "She abandoned us," had echoed like a closing door, Helen sat at her kitchen table with a sheet of thick cream-colored paper, the kind she kept for special occasions. It was the same kind she used for her daughter's first wedding invitation draft, decades earlier. Now, it was going to hold something much heavier. She didn't plan to write at first. It began as a reflex, an impulse stirred by the invisible weight of being misunderstood. She poured a cup of tea, lit the old ceramic candle Lily once made in kindergarten, and sat in her soft chair, the one by the window where she used to watch her daughter walk to school with an oversized backpack and pink mittens. The snow had started to fall outside, quietly dusting the earth like forgiveness that came too late. She began with, "You don't know what I carried for you." Then paused. She stared at the words, her breath catching between memory and resolve. There was so much she wanted to say, so many clarities she had choked back over the years for the sake of peace, for the hope that love would eventually be enough. She wanted to tell her daughter how hard it had been to work 2 jobs while raising her alone, how she had gone without heating one winter so her could afford ballet lessons, how she had stayed silent during those long years when her daughter dismissed her every concern with the sharpness of someone trying to cut ties with her past. She wrote about the day her daughter left for college, how she had stood at the bus terminal long after it pulled away, clutching the scarf her mother had once knitted for her. Helen had gone home to an empty kitchen that night and made dinner for 2 anyway, just in case someone came back. But the letter didn't stay tender. The next paragraph carried the rawness she had never dared to voice. "You speak of abandonment, but I was the one left standing with full arms in an empty room. You turned your back on me long before I stopped knocking." The pen trembled in her fingers, not from age, from truth. She wrote until her tea went cold and the candle had burned down to its edges. Line after line poured from her, memories, confessions, even quiet rage she had buried so deeply it startled her now. And when she reached the end, she found herself writing a sentence that had waited years to be born. "You don't see me, not anymore, but I have not vanished." Helen stared at that sentence, her throat tight. The house was utterly still. Outside, the snow covered the fence posts and hedges, blanketing the world in silence. A silence that mirrored the one inside her, heavy, but not empty. She folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, but she didn't seal it. She left it on the table next to her mug and turned off the lights. Upstairs, in her room, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying each word. The temptation to send it pulsed through her. Maybe it would make her daughter understand. Maybe it would soften the edges of a heart that had grown blind to its own debt. But just before dawn, Helen got up, walked down the creaking stairs, and stood once more at the kitchen table. The letter waited there like a mirror. She picked it up, held it close for a breath, and then, slowly, deliberately, began to tear it. Not in rage, not in defeat, in calm finality. Piece by piece, she let it fall into the trash. Then she turned on the stove and began heating water for another cup of tea. A ritual, familiar and grounding. As she waited for the kettle to sing, she set the table for one, placemat, spoon, her favorite porcelain cup. No one was coming, and still she prepared the morning with quiet dignity. She had said everything she needed to say, just not in a way they could hear. Because sometimes the truth isn't meant to be delivered. It's meant to be known by the one who lived it, the one who carried it alone. And in that quiet act of destruction, Helen didn't lose her voice. She protected it. The house creaked under the weight of memory, not from age, though it was old, but from the lives it had held. Birthdays, scraped knees, whispered lullabies, arguments behind closed doors, and apologies that came too late. Helen stood at the threshold of her living room, her fingers tracing the faded grooves in the doorframe where she had marked her daughter's height with a pencil year after year. The last mark was from the summer before college. After that, the doorframe remained untouched, like so many things between them. It was a Thursday morning, mid-October, when Helen made her quiet exit. There were no dramatic speeches, no boxes piled on the lawn, no teary farewells. She had simply decided. And when a woman like Helen decides, it is never impulsive. It is the result of years of small silences that have finally run out of space. That week, she had packed what she needed. Just the essentials, a few clothes, her Bible, a bundle of old letters tied in blue ribbon, and a framed photo of her mother smiling beneath the apple tree in spring. Everything else, the heirlooms, the china, the furniture she had chosen with such care, she left behind. Things, after all, were not what tethered her to this world. It was dignity, and that she would take with her. She cleaned the house one last time, polished the floors, washed the curtains, folded the linens with a tenderness that no one would witness. She watered the plants, even though she knew they would wither in her absence. Then she gathered the box of toys she had kept for the grandchildren, puzzles with missing pieces, stuffed animals that smelled faintly of baby powder, and placed them gently into a donation bag. There was no need to keep waiting for small feet that would never come running again. That afternoon, she stood in the living room one final time. The sun angled through the windows just right, casting long golden shadows on the hardwood floor. For a moment, she was transported back to the sound of a toddler's laughter, the patter of little feet, the scent of cinnamon rolls fresh from the oven. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Without a word, she turned the lock on the front door. The sound was barely audible, just a soft metallic click. But to Helen, it was thunder. That was the sound of something ending, a covenant perhaps, or maybe just the illusion of one. No one was there to hear it, not her daughter, not the grandchildren, not the neighbors who had once borrowed sugar and now barely nodded in passing. But that was the point. The people who should have heard it had stopped listening long ago. Helen walked to her car slowly. No rush. She looked back once, not out of longing, but to honor the years. The house had sheltered her body, yes, but not her spirit, not for a long time. That part of her had begun to move on long before her feet ever did. She drove toward the edge of town, where autumn burned the trees in brilliant shades of orange and red. The road curved gently, as if cradling her decision, carrying her forward. She didn't know where she was going exactly, only that it wouldn't be back. Later that evening, her daughter came by the house after work. She had forgotten to return a key Helen had lent her years ago. She found the place quiet, spotless. There was no note, no forwarding address, just a faint scent of lavender and something she couldn't quite name. Maybe finality. She checked the usual places. No signs of life, no teacup on the kitchen table, no humming from upstairs. She frowned, confused, maybe even annoyed. Why didn't she say anything? She muttered to no one. But Helen had said plenty, just not in words. Her absence was not a question, it was an answer, and the locked door, now standing between them, was not an act of cruelty. It was the sound of a woman finally choosing herself. The seasons shifted. Snow came and went. Summer bloomed in quiet colors, then faded once more into the rust of early fall. In the silence Helen left behind, time moved forward as if nothing had changed, at least from the outside. Birthdays passed. Holidays were celebrated, awkwardly, with fewer chairs needed at the table. Her name was not mentioned often. When it was, it came wrapped in discomfort, like a topic that belonged to another room. Helen had settled in a small town 2 hours north, near a lake she used to visit with her late husband. She found a modest cottage with ivy on the fence and a red mailbox that creaked when opened. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. The walls didn't echo with judgment. The floors didn't creak beneath the weight of expectation. And for the first time in years, Helen exhaled in her own home. She joined the local library's knitting circle, a quiet group of women who didn't ask too many questions, who measured friendship in cups of tea and shared silence rather than gossip. There, she rediscovered something she hadn't realized she'd lost, the ability to laugh without watching her words. She even started writing again, small journal entries, reflections on the world outside her window, and letters she would never send. On her birthday that year, no calls came, no cards, not even a message from the group chat she had been quietly removed from. The silence stung, but not in the way it once did. It was no longer a wound, it was a scar, a reminder of where the fire had been. That evening, Helen lit a single candle on a cupcake she bought herself from the town bakery and made a wish that wasn't bitter, just clear, to be seen without needing to scream. 2 months later, a question was whispered into a quiet room. Lily, now older, more observant, sat with her mother on the living room rug surrounded by toys and forgotten wrappers from another rushed dinner. "Mom," she asked, not accusingly but with innocent curiosity, "why did Grandma disappear?" The question lingered. Her daughter froze for a second, unsure of what story to give, what truth to hide behind. She muttered something vague about space and tired relationships. But even Lily, young as she was, sensed something else, something unsaid. A week later, the daughter found herself holding a box of old family photographs. She was searching for a school project photo when her fingers stopped on a picture she hadn't seen in years. Her mother, Helen, standing behind her with both hands on her shoulders, laughing with eyes closed, mouth wide, unguarded. That picture had once made her roll her eyes. Now it made her pause. She kept staring at the photo long after the rest had been put away. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator, and in that stillness, the memory returned not as guilt, but as weight, a quiet acknowledgement. She was there, and I forgot to thank her. That winter, she tried calling Helen for the first time in almost a year. The number no longer worked. Months passed. Then one spring afternoon, a letter arrived. Not from Helen, but from the notary office handling her modest affairs. It wasn't a will. Helen had little left in possessions, but she had left something. A note, handwritten with the same calm pen she had always used in recipe cards and holiday messages. It read, "I never needed to be needed. I only wanted to be remembered with kindness. If you read this, I hope you remember the times I showed up, not the moment I stopped." Love doesn't vanish, but sometimes it steps back to protect what remains. There were no accusations, no bitterness, just clarity, and the quiet sound of emotional justice being served in the only way Helen had ever known, not with anger, but with truth. The daughter sat on the porch that evening, Helen's letter folded on her lap. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying scents of lilac and something older, more rooted. And for the first time in a long time, she said her mother's name out loud, not in frustration, not in dismissal, but in memory. The cottage by the lake stood quietly in the early morning mist, its wooden steps softened by moss and time. The rocking chair on the porch, Helen's favorite place, remained as she left it, angled slightly toward the east, where the sun crept in slowly through the fog. It rocked gently in the wind that morning, creaking not from movement, but from memory. A sound so familiar, so steady, that anyone who had known her could recognize its rhythm. If they had come. Inside, the house was still. A mug sat near the window, a book open to a page halfway through. A pair of glasses rested neatly beside it. Her cardigan, folded over the edge of the couch, still held the soft scent of lavender soap and dried leaves. Helen had left no chaos behind, no loose ends, just quiet, the kind of quiet that came not from emptiness, but completion. It was the landlord who discovered her, peaceful, seated in her chair by the fireplace, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, the same shawl she had once offered to Lily in the car on a cold autumn day, only to have it returned with polite indifference. Her eyes were closed, her face calm. If it weren't for the stillness in her chest, she could have been mistaken for someone simply resting between chapters of a story. After the necessary calls were made, after the modest belongings were sorted and passed along to charity, one thing remained, a leather-bound journal tucked beneath her bed, wrapped in brown ribbon. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't labeled, "Read me," but it waited nonetheless. Weeks later, after silence had settled again like dust, the journal arrived at her daughter's door, delivered by a woman from the local knitting group, who said little except, she wanted this to find its way back. Her daughter held the journal with trembling hands. She hesitated for days before opening it. When she did, it wasn't a ledger of blame or pain. It was a collection of entries, short, thoughtful reflections, memories of Lily's laugh, recipes for the pies no one ever asked her to bake again, prayers for strength on the days she felt invisible, and truths she never dared to speak aloud. One page stood out. It read, "Today I realized I am no longer angry, just sad for the years we wasted pretending we were close. I wonder if, one day, they will hear the silence I left behind and understand that it wasn't a punishment. It was my way of surviving." Another, dated only a few weeks before her passing, simply said, "There is peace in being forgotten when you no longer need to be remembered for survival. I rocked today until the sun disappeared. It felt like forgiveness." The daughter closed the journal and held it to her chest. She was alone now, No husband to make excuses to, no children asking for snacks or screen time. Just her, the creaking echo of her mother's last words, and a rocking chair she never thought to sit in before. That summer, she visited the lake. She found the cottage. The landlord allowed her to walk through. Nothing had changed. She stepped onto the porch and sat down in the rocking chair. At first, it felt strange, like slipping into a memory you were never part of. But as the chair began to move, slow and steady, something settled inside her. Not guilt, not even regret, just the weight of presence. She looked out across the water, the same view her mother had watched every day. The wind carried no voices, but she swore she could hear the echo of a teacup placed gently on wood. A sigh that never became a confrontation. A goodbye that sounded more like a breath. In the end, Helen didn't demand love. She didn't script her own redemption. She just left behind a chair that still rocked in her absence, and a truth too soft for words, too strong to be ignored. Because some stories don't end. They hum quietly in the spaces we failed to notice, until silence teaches us how to listen.